The Star Wars universe is well and truly vast, one of the largest and most internally complex fictional universes of all time. It comes with incredible amounts of information for inquisitive fans to absorb, built over the course of nearly 40 years of storytelling. What is today known as Star Wars Legends is perhaps one of the greatest collections of stories, and in this video we're going to be discussing the whole EU and how us Star Wars YouTubers just seem to have an endless amount of ideas. The story of the expanded universe begins in 1976, 6 months before the release of the first movies. In December that year, a novelization of A New Hope was released, having been ghostwritten by Alan Dean Foster. When A New Hope and the rest of the original trilogy had been released and the canon of the wider Star Wars universe was being established, the novelizations of the movies were treated as expanded universe works, canon where they didn't contradict the films themselves, technically making the EU predate the movies themselves. Now, before we go any further, we should establish how the canon worked before Disney took over. Contrary to what some believe, what is now Star Wars Legends was not non-canon. The Star Wars universe at the time had a tiered canon system in which certain works had canonical precedence over the others. The highest tier was G canon, which was comprised of the movies and the direct word of George Lucas, which overruled everything beneath it. T canon, the next tier, was pretty much just Star Wars, the Clone Wars. C canon, the tier beneath that, was the one in which the vast majority of the expanded universe was sorted into, including most of the novels, comics, and spin-offs. S canon, the tier below that, was for older or more subjective sources like video games or the holiday special. Below that was a tier for works explicitly produced as non-canon, like Star Wars Infinities or Lego Star Wars. One of the earliest EU works was the first novel that wasn't an adaptation of the films, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, written by Alan Dean Foster on Lucas's behest to serve as the basis of a possible low-budget sequel to A New Hope. When A New Hope was wildly successful, Lucas wrote his own sequels, and Splinter of the Mind's Eye remained a novel, one that would become a well-known staple for the budding EU. An even more well-known, and more infamously so, work of the early EU was the Star Wars Holiday Special, which was released in 1978. The Holiday Special was panned, and for a good reason. We're warning you now, just don't watch it. George Lucas wasn't kidding when he said every copy of it should be hunted down and burned. But for all its terribleness, the Holiday Special made some important additions to the canon, including the planet Kashyyyk, Chewbacca's family, and Boba Fett. Another crucial staple of the EU ran from 1977 to 1986, Marvel's Star Wars comic line, which may well have saved Marvel from financial ruin. The comics, which were originally just a comic adaptation of the first movies, continued the stories of the heroes of Yavin from where A New Hope left off, focusing primarily on side adventures instead of grand stories. As more Star Wars movies were released, the catalogue of expanded universe expanded to include 2 trilogies of novels, one based around Han Solo and the other based around Lando Calrissian, which actually played a big role in setting up the geopolitical layout and history of the wider Star Wars galaxy, for all their cheesiness. Following the release of The Return of the Jedi and the conclusion of the original trilogy, Star Wars began to branch into spin-off territory. 2 live-action films focused on the Ewoks were released in 1984 and 1985, titled Caravan of Courage and The Battle for Endor respectively. An animated Ewoks cartoon was also put out in 1985 and ran for 2 seasons. A second cartoon, called Droids, focused on the adventures of R2-D2 and C-3PO in the years before the Battle of Yavin, which was easily the best of the various spin-offs and introduced a variety of important EU characters and concepts. But in 1987, after Star Wars' 10th anniversary, EU content began to slump off. Fans began to fear the franchise was dead. The only major content to come out during this dark age was the Star Wars role-playing game and a whole lot of supplementary material, which introduced the Aurebesh written language and laid the foundation for EU works to come. While Star Wars may have seemed dead, its greatest age was yet to come. In 1991, the dark times came to an end with the release of one of the best EU novels of all time, Heir to the Empire. Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn was the first book in the renowned Thrawn trilogy, which this time we do recommend you check out. The Thrawn trilogy completely reshaped Star Wars. Not only did it revive the expanded universe, but it also changed it, giving it a much more serious tone than earlier works. The renewal of interest in Star Wars that the trilogy generated even had a role in George Lucas's decision to finally sit down and make the prequels a few years later. 1991 began the golden age of the expanded Star Wars universe. The Thrawn trilogy wasn't the only work to come out at that time as well. Lucasfilm transferred its comics license from Marvel to Dark Horse, who put out Star Wars' best comic to date, beginning with Dark Empire. Dark Empire took place after the end of the Thrawn trilogy and resurrected the character of Palpatine, a move that is still controversial. More novels released during the 90s continued to flesh out the post-Return of the Jedi era, including Truce at Bakura and the Jedi Prince and X-Wing series. But arguably, some of the best bits of EU lore to come out of the 90s was the foundation of the Old Republic era. As Lucas wanted to write the prequels to the original trilogy himself, Lucasfilm forbade any EU storytellers from delving into that time period. But the writers at Dark Horse were able to get around this by instead writing a story set 4,000 years in the past. This story became the Tales of the Jedi comics, an incredibly underrated series that had a massive impact on how the Jedi and Sith were treated in the EU. In 1996, rumors of a forthcoming prequel trilogy began to spread, and a tremendous hype build-up began. A multimedia project called Shadows of the Empire fleshed out the year between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and became so popular that George Lucas added a reference to it in the special editions of the original trilogy, which were released in 1997. Also included in the special editions was Coruscant, a planet that the expanded universe had introduced, and that Lucas integrated heavily into the prequel trilogy. With the release of The Phantom Menace in 1999, Star Wars experienced an explosive resurgence, and the EU rode this wave as audiences eagerly awaited Attack of the Clones. With that era of the Star Wars universe finally being opened up, writers immediately began fleshing out the context for The Phantom Menace, mostly in the form of stories set in the decades before the events of the movie. Other writers kept fleshing out the post-Return of the Jedi era, and a few months after The Phantom Menace's release, the novel Vector Prime introduced the Yuuzhan Vong, and, to the outrage of many fans, it killed off Chewbacca as well. With the release of Attack of the Clones, writers finally began to explore the Clone Wars, and they did so in earnest. As the Star Wars Clone Wars cartoon served as the flagship for this EU expansion, a massive multimedia project began, churning out novels, comics, and video games to flesh out the Clone Wars. This project continued right up until the Revenge of the Sith, which concluded the Star Wars saga for a time and opened up a final era of the galaxy's history for exploration, the early Dark Times. One cannot discuss the prequel era expanded universe without mentioning the video games. LucasArts had its golden age between 1996 and 2005, and it concluded that age in spectacular fashion, releasing a holy trinity of Star Wars games: Knights of the Old Republic, Battlefront 2, and Republic Commando. Knights of the Old Republic and its sequel in particular were important additions to the EU, as they fleshed out the Old Republic era even further, spawning spin-off novels and comic series. We should also discuss the essential guides. In the latter half of the 1990s, the story team churned out the first wave of Star Wars essential guides, while the end of the prequel era saw most of these guides re-released and updated, and the post-2005 era saw new guides added to the catalogue as well. The essential guides knit together the entire expanded universe, producing a consistent framework in history that made the Star Wars galaxy feel more interconnected than ever before. They were a must-have for expanded universe fans, and they're second only to Wikipedia as far as getting information for our videos goes. With the conclusion of the Star Wars saga for a time, the expanded universe became the focus of the story team, which began a new multimedia project in 2008. That project was centered around the release of the new TV show Star Wars: The Clone Wars, which came to dominate new expanded universe stories right up until the Disney buyout, together with Star Wars: The Old Republic and its own multimedia project. Other stories were told as well. The post-Return of the Jedi era continued to be fleshed out, while Star Wars Darth Plagueis knitted together several elements of the prequel trilogy wonderfully. But all good things must come to an end, and on April 25th, 2014, Disney rebranded the whole EU as Star Wars Legends in preparation for its forthcoming sequel trilogy. So, that was the story of the stories we tell on the channel, the vast and glorious Star Wars Expanded Universe. But what do you think? Are you particularly interested in any of the stories we've mentioned here? Feel free to let us know in the comments section below, and also let me know how you feel about these meta type videos where we talk about things kind of outside of the context of the universe itself. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.